Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. If you're new to The Authority File, we encourage you to sign up for our monthly newsletter, The Authority File Roundup, which keeps you updated on previous, current, and upcoming Authority File episodes. You can subscribe at choice360.org by clicking on the newsletter banner at the top of the homepage. So here's a question for you. What's the function of a library? Given who's listening to this podcast, that might sound like a rhetorical question, but my guests for this series have published a new book called Unpacking the Personal Library, The Public and Private Life of Books, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. In it, they collect essays and stories that interrogate the meaning and purpose of a variety of libraries, like libraries at foreign embassies, or the personal libraries of authors, politicians, and poets. While doing so, we learn about the relationship between libraries and archives, how using digitized resources differs from wandering the stacks, and even what the value of libraries are to the great variety of individuals who curate them and visit them. Joining me are the co-editors of Unpacking the Personal Library, Jason Kamlott, Professor of English and Research Chair in Literature and Sound Studies at Concordia University, and Jeffrey Weingarten, Professor in the School of Language and Liberal Studies at Fanshawe College. This series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. In this final episode with Jason and Jeffrey, we talk about their key takeaways regarding the methods of collecting and curating various kinds of library holdings and how they think their book deals with the evolution of collection development. So we've touched on this at various times, but I'm wondering, as you've developed this collection of essays in your book, for each of you, what are some of your personal key takeaways regarding the methods of collecting and curating various kinds of library holdings? For example, private collections as objectification, private collections to support a profession, public collections achieving a certain scale, and so on. And Jeffrey, why don't we start with you on that?
Sure, yeah. I think one of the great things about this experience is, as I said earlier, I mean, Jason and I, we had such different academic roles and we were at such different stages and working with such different materials at the time that we really approached the questions, with the same respect for the material, the same fascinations and curiosities. And then at the same time, we've said different things at different times when talking about what we take away from the book. So I think Jason, when we've had chats or whatever, is often talking about the curatorial approach, because that's obviously been so big, for him, and the cultural meaning. And that, for me, I keep going back to that experience of being, a mid career PhD, halfway through my program, and struggling to write this conference paper and not knowing if F.R. Scott's library is going to give me enough material to do that.
Yeah.
And so for me, one of the big takeaways from the book is that the library is this very complicated and complex research tool, and that we can't really make any assumptions about its meaning. So there was a scholar in the 1980s who wrote about F.R. Scott's library, a guy named Bruce Whiteman, and he had said that the most valuable things in Scott's library were the books of poetry, which showed what he read. And as I said, the books of poetry were often unopened. They were gifted to him. And so I thought it was interesting that Whiteman would make this assumption that the poetry is the most valuable thing because F.R. Scott was a poet. So I really seized on that in the article, and I said, the most important thing in that collection, I still remember this professor in undergrad saying, never use the word significant in a paper because it's such a subjective term, and it's a kind of a good point, because what's significant to Bruce Whiteman is the fact that these books were owned and thus they were read. But anyone who owns books knows that what we own, we don't often read.
Yeah.
So especially academics, I think. So I mean, there is, I think, the tendency to make assumptions about what the library is and what will be important in it. And I was realizing over years of researching this that we really have to suspend all assumptions. That when I read F.R. Scott's library, it was actually telling me more about his reputation than it was telling me about his reading.
Mm.
When I read John Ulov's library catalog of the books he owned, it actually showed me more about him as a person who read history than as a person who wrote poetry. And I mean, I think for me, like a great example of this is if I were much more famous than I am and someone wanted my library someday, that if I had this leather bound Shakespeare that was passed on in as part of my bequest to some place, they would say, wow, this is valuable because it's culturally valuable, it's financial, it's economically valuable. And they might not ever realize that I've only ever held on to that book in the same way I hold on to my grandma's Christmas cards, that it was a gift and I felt like I had to keep it. But it was very heavy and annoying to move from place to place. And I had no special connection to it. They would never know that this slim volume of Titus Andronicus that's all worn out and ripped is my most important book because it's the first time I got an A+ in undergrad, writing a paper on Titus. So we just don't know, and I think that the fact that that's one book, that's the life of one book, and we can't really be too presumptuous about what a library means or how it should or can be perceived. That books, they shed meaning, they gain new meaning, and it's always kind of in the eye of the beholder, and we have to just be careful about making too many assumptions when we go into an archive like this.
Excellent. Jason, how about you?
So, if the question is about what happens to books when they move from private to public spaces, right? And I think there are a lot of different ways to think about this. We think of books as this book is a resource for a particular sort of pursuit of knowledge, right? Books as assemblages have different cultural meanings. So like, as Jeffrey was saying, their significance really will vary depending on the kinds of research questions you're interested in asking them, right? So an individual author's library may be valuable. So for example, Walter Pater's library, when I was writing my dissertation, I was writing a chapter on Walter Pater. And a very important book to me was a book that cataloged Pater's library, to know every book that he had read, right? So that I could understand, had he read Schlegel or not, and so was this passage of one of his critical essays perhaps built on this other author's idea? So one of the reasons scholars are interested in personal libraries is really to understand the intellectual development of a single author. And if an author dies and we don't have that and in one sense, you don't really need, this is what I thought at the time anyways, you don't really need the actual books that Pater had, although that would be super cool to have them, to be in Pater's library, but you need the list of books, right? In order to, and then I would go to the, to any version of that book and look, I'm focusing purely on the content of the actual books, right? So one thing that gets lost when we don't have those records, right, is simply, the significance of the library as a working atelier for the development of that particular author's work. And that's a very common sort of use of individual libraries in literary research in any case, cataloging and the way we might potentially. So I was, in my introduction, I talk about how a lot of personal libraries make their way into public library collections as a sort of wider resource. Often they're not, they get lost then in the larger sort of library catalog of that public library, because there's not a special sort of metadata field that indicates, well, these books were originally from this, personal collection. I think so. Cataloging can be a really interesting tool for creating kind of layers, almost like thinking of a public library as a palimpsest of a whole bunch of source libraries that made their way into this wider collection, which could be very useful to researchers to know about, right? If so-and-so's library was absorbed into this public library, if we at least had, kind of tags and one could search, one could facet that larger library for the individual libraries of which they're comprised, then that could be really interesting and useful, Yeah, so I don't know. Those are just some things I'm thinking about in terms of what happens to books. I mean, really, in many ways, they change, though. As soon as you move a book from one context into another, its significance and its the way people look at it and how they're going to use it will change significantly. And that's for me, that's as a book historian, that's a very interesting thing. I'm really interested in sort of the stories surrounding the significance of books in different contexts.
Yeah, that's great, and it's a good segue to this next question. And I'm wondering, this idea of collection development. That it just seems over the course of our conversation, across this series of episodes, that there's a bit of awkwardness between, say, a public or even academic library in a sort of traditional sense in their practice of collection development, and then bringing in these or incorporating these private collections, into that bigger collection. I'm wondering what you think has been revealed through your interrogations of the ways personal and public collections have historically been created and used. Like, are we, maybe this is sort of a mutually exclusive practice, but the collecting and developing private collections versus collecting and developing a public or academic collection, um, where do they intersect? Is that process a little bumpy? They're it seems like they're two very different practices in terms of building a personal or private collection versus a public or academic collection. I'm wondering if that raises any thoughts for either of you.
Well, I'll start. I just want to say, like, continuing what I was just sort of getting at, like that part of my interest in libraries is as a book historian and a kind of an interest in the history of readership, right? And so that's a very different way to go to a library and study a library than to go to a library to get a book that has information I need to write my paper, right?
Yeah.
At one point in my introduction, I say something kind of coy, like that books held in public libraries are all private to some degree, insofar as they are the objects of experiential encounter with individual readers, right? So you could say there's
I
no such
remember
thing.
that. Yeah.
There's no such thing as a public library because, like, basically, if an individual is experiencing a book in that public library, there's a very private thing that's happening in relation to these things.
Yeah.
And there are sort of reading experience projects, sort of readership projects that are trying to use books as sources for information about those kinds of experiences. But to some extent, that's a very different mandate than a university library to provide books so that scientists and scholars can pursue their research. Right? They're not.
Yeah.
And I think that the goals of institutions in building their libraries for coverage, to deliver materials that are necessary for research to proceed in certain ways is, for obvious reasons, the primary mandate that's governing the selection of books and the decisions they make over what books they have or not, and the costs of preserving sort of redundancies because they represented an assemblage that may be of cultural interest in relation to that individual's collection of things, is extremely valuable from my perspective, but also just not a cost that most institutions are able to afford right now. And so Jeffrey's sort of compliment to me on making this happen, with a Richler library, like, it's not as though Richler's library is more valuable than many other authors' libraries. It just so happened that the situation, all the pieces fell into place where there was a provost and a dean and a pushy lawyer on the estate side and some vacant space and, et cetera, that allowed this particular library to be preserved. Right. But it's not very common. It's a very difficult thing to hold these kinds of personal collections intact.
Yep. Jeffrey, anything you want to add?
Yeah, just what Jason had said there about, Richler being more or less important than other authors as sort of a cultural figure, I think is interesting too, because how much of a library is preserved, I think, does in a lot of cases have to do with how famous was the person. And I had Florence McNeil, a little known Canadian poet, an excellent poet, but just kind of someone who fell by the wayside of the canon. I got in touch with her the year she died and was interviewing her through letters for my book. And when she died, her husband sent me a bunch of magazines and books and things that she had owned in her private library, and asked me, like, he said, I couldn't find a university that would take them. Would you like them? And these are irreplaceable, handmade journals from the 60s and 70s. And I had no idea what to do with them. I took them, and then I think I ended up in the end trying to give them to McGill to see if they would just take them.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's quite a long time ago. I don't remember how it all unfolded. I kept some of them, though, because McGill said they couldn't guarantee or whoever I talked to anyway, said they couldn't guarantee they wouldn't get thrown out.
Yeah.
Because Florence McNeil was someone of no consequence. So, which is another interesting thing, because the individual journals themselves, independent of who owned them, would have historical value. But there was this label of, well, this is a lesser poet's library. And so even the content itself wasn't being taken seriously. So anyway, I think that there are many, many layers to how a collection is perceived as valuable. And I mean, you would imagine that absolutely not a single book from Shakespeare's library would get tossed out if he donated it somewhere.
Yeah, right.
But Florence McNeil, I get no promises.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting take. But Jason, Jeffrey, that's actually all the time we have. This was really terrific. I feel like there was so much more we could have talked about. And so thank you very much for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
You just heard from Jason Camlott, Professor of English and Research Chair in Literature and Sound Studies at Concordia University, and Jeffrey Weingarten, Professor in the School of Language and Liberal Studies at Fanshawe College. This series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.